Welcome to the Recruitment Hackers Podcast, a show about innovations, technology, and leaders in the recruitment industry. Brought to you by Talkpush, the leading recruitment automation platform.
Hello, welcome back to the Recruitment Hackers Podcast. I'm your host, Max Armbruster, and today on this show, we're going to talk about hiring remotely and how do you do that at scale. I'm delighted to welcome to the show Liam Martin. Liam is the co-founder of Staff.com, Time Doctor, which helps employers hire employees from anywhere in the world and help manage their time. The co-organizer of the Running Remote conference, which has been going around for a few years, and great timing on that, Liam. And recently you took that Running Remote title and you slapped it on a book.
That is true.
And so we'll talk about that book. Thanks for coming on, Liam, and looking forward to picking your brain on how to hire remotely.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think that hiring remotely is actually one of those issues that hasn't really been addressed all that much during what I like to call the pandemic panic period of remote work, the last 2.5 years, because no one really had to learn how to hire remotely because they were literally just transitioning their teams to a remote work model. And now I think we're actually going to see a lot of work being done in this space.
Yeah, and then last year, the big theme was the Great Resignation. And I don't know if the numbers have come in yet on whether people have been able to retain their remote workers, but certainly I'm hearing a lot of people saying it's harder to hire now because people refuse non-remote work. So there's a whole segment of the population that refuses to come back in.
Yeah, there's a statistic that I heard actually when I was speaking at a conference a couple months ago, and I'm going to parrot it here. It may or may not be true, but supposedly more people quit in the month of June last year in the United States than in the history of the United States, which is a pretty scary statistic when you think about it. So many people quitting their jobs. And when you look at the actual reasons as to why people are doing it, it all ties back to remote work, undoubtedly. It is fundamentally easier to enter and leave a job now with remote work than it was in the past. So it's even more important to be able to retain that talent. And I think there's a bunch of strategies that people can implement to be able to do that. But before you even do that, you need to actually hire them, which is right a little bit more of a complicated process. Yeah, hiring the right people, I got some counterintuitive perspectives towards that.
Okay, great. Well, before we dive into those, perhaps for those who don't know Time Doctor and Running Remote, could you give us like the 1 minute overview of what you do?
Sure. So Time Doctor is a time tracking tool for remote teams. That company's been in operation for about 11 years. We effectively, lovingly call it Fitbit for work. And it really came out of the problem that I was having, which was I actually had a business before Time Doctor, which was a tutoring business. And I couldn't actually measure how long a tutor worked with a student. It was creating a big problem inside of that business. So Time Doctor scratched that itch. The second business, which was born out of basically our core mission statement, which is trying to help the world transition towards remote work, was Running Remote. And we did one of our team retreats in Boracay, which is a very small island. It's the party island in the Philippines. And we said, how do we get to it's a great spot, isn't it?
Yeah, great fun.
Lots of Red Horse that we drank there. I think I got very, very drunk at the end of that actual team retreat. And the issue that we had was there was so much information on how to hire a virtual assistant or how to be a digital nomad, but we didn't want to know those things. We wanted to know, how do we get to 250 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people as a remote first organization? A lot of remote companies, and since you've been remote from the inception, you probably know this, they have a bit of their chip on their shoulder where they're kind of seen as like lifestyle businesses, right? Like, oh, that's a cute little $500,000 a year business that you have. I hope that it goes well, as opposed to really the incredibly fast growing segment of the market that I think it is today. I actually think remote first organizations are going to be the majority of hyper growth tech companies within the next 5 years. And so we're really frustrated at this. There was no information. And I just said, okay, let's do a ready, shoot, aim philosophy. Let's just get a menu. And then I'll talk to a couple of my friends that are in the remote workspace and see if we can put something together. And that was the beginning of Running Remote, which we are finally going back to in-person conferences, May 17th and 18th in Montreal, Canada. And we've got a great grab a speakers that are really coming from. It's an interesting time for us actually, because this is the first physical conference we've had since we've basically come back from COVID, and remote work has changed so much. I think it's a complete kind of reimagining of what remote work is, and I'm excited to be able to do the conference.
I hope you have a good sales team for this event, because it seems like every tech company has got a story to tell now on how to run remote. So
I completely agree on that one. I actually have a bit of an insider joke here. Is there's so many remote companies coming out of the woodwork that said that they were remote pioneers, before, like, basically, if someone is legit, to me, it was, did I know about them pre-COVID? If I knew about them pre-COVID, they're automatically legit, because I've gotten pitched by I got a dozen this week. Gotta speak at the conference. Seems so critical for me to speak at the conference. I know everything about remote work. And then I check their Google quiz data and they're like 3 months old, right? And it's dude, come on.
You missed the early adopters. Well, all right, let's talk about, the good thing about the early adopters is they make all the mistakes and they learn all the lessons and they clear the space. So let's talk about the mistakes that we've made as employers hiring remotely. And we were speaking beforehand about the Steve Jobs philosophy that you should know who are not your customers better than who are your customers. Could you expand on that and discuss how that applies to candidates as customers?
Sure. There's this talk, and I don't know if it's on the internet somewhere. I've watched it a couple times, where this interviewer asks Steve Jobs, will you ever have a sub $1,000 notebook? And that's when $1,000 was, a lot of money, not in the hyperinflation days of today. And he said, no, I'll never build $1,000 notebook, because none of our customers are sub $1,000 notebook people. Like, we only target people that can afford a $1,000 plus notebook. And when you think about that, it's actually a really good measure to be able to identify who your customer is. We talked about running remote. Digital nomads, not our customer. A business that has, 1 to 2 employees, not our customer. People that don't want to go remote, are not interested in it at all, not our customer. What are we interested in? We're interested in people that are interested in building and scaling remote and hybrid teams, and are really excited about building a business, not necessarily building, a lifestyle business on the side that makes 10 grand a year or something like that. As that applies to people, I think you still have to have the same philosophy. So we have a culture test internally where we really focus on and I love the term culture because it's used so often in the tech startup world, but no one really knows what the hell it means. You have to have a really important culture. What does that mean? Like, what does that mean? Aeron shares and like free lunch? Is that culture? No, it's not culture. The sociological definition of culture is, what are the unique activities that you do that other groups do not? So we really try to identify what makes us unique as a culture. And then we try to get rid of people that don't necessarily want to apply to that particular model of working. So we have, before the pandemic, a big one was we work remotely. We'll never have an office. We have team members in 43 different countries all over the world. Everyone will work remotely. We will never have an office ever. If you're interested in having an office, don't come work here. That's an example of those types of cultural touch points that I think are really important before making those long-term purchases, which are basically the most important purchases in your business, which is your.
That's a good practice for people who are doing first interviews, is to really outline who should not be applying for a job, and in a way to let the candidate or the potential future hire screen you out as an employer and say, well, this isn't going to do it for me, because they're very adamant about the fact that they don't want this and they don't want that. And that could be done, as a first interview. In your case, you said it's a test that you've built in a culture test.
So we generally, and I took this leadership from Shopify actually, where the candidates that are brought in, they figure out there's a first pass of, do they meet the base requirements for the position? They do not do any technical. Their first test that they do is a culture test, because they recognize if you're perfectly, positioned for this job from a technical perspective, but you don't have the right culture fit, we're going to hire you and then you're going to quit in 6 months, which is the worst. I mean, that's the absolute worst place to be. You've gone through onboarding, you've integrated them into your culture, you've spent all that managerial overhead to be able to get them into your organization, and then they quit, right? That's the absolute worst place to be. So they're realizing, well, let's not be tempted by technical fit. Let's actually just focus on cultural fit first. And then if they meet the cultural fit, then we talk about technical fit.
Great. And so in running remotes, you've written about the best practices to put in place for hiring remotely. Is that part of your standard toolkit that you recommend? Is a culture test at the front? Are there some other methodologies that you advocate for?
Well, so even from a psychosomatic or psychometrics perspective, there's some interesting data as well. Remote work really is very friendly towards introverted people. So this is one of the strongest signals that we've had. And the way that we're measuring that is basically retention. So does someone quit, right? Remote first organizations, if you're extroverted, your chance of quitting goes up. And we think it's simply because people get lonely. So the way that you solve for that, you can hire extroverted people. You just need to be able to keep entertained in some other way, which is going to a co-working space, sending them to coffee shops, getting them a social circle that's not necessarily their work circle is a way to be able to hedge against that. But fundamentally, introversion, counterintuitively, is by far the most important variable that we found that is going to make for a successful long-term hire.
When I'm going through the people in my company in my head and thinking, yeah, the extroverts would be the exception. So do you think that by that token, it's going to be difficult for certain organizations that are more maybe sales reliant and that need to offer a service approach? I mean, in fact, we know that a lot of the BPO world, the call center world, has managed to move to hybrid or some even fully remote. And they need to hire extroverts, I would imagine. So it can be done, but maybe you're saying it'd be easier for companies that are hiring remote teams of engineers, for example, which tend to be more introverts.
To a degree, I mean, I think there are introverted salespeople. There are people that are able to build that deep, intimate connection with just one person, and it can work. But I agree with you. The vast majority of salespeople just are, they're attracted towards extroverted perspectives as it applies to sales. But I would say, I mean, I actually think remote and where we are right now, like January, 4% of the US workforce was working remotely. March, 45% of the US workforce was working remotely. Like, wham, exponential jump. And that's the biggest transition since the Industrial Revolution in work. But the Industrial Revolution took 80 years and we did it in March. So we've completely transformed the way that work is being done. And long-term, we're projecting 30% of the US workforce will be working remotely, literally like 2022 and on, post-pandemic. So there's got to be a place for these people to go. And whether you're introverted, extroverted, you really have to actually learn a couple key variables to succeed from a hiring perspective, from a working perspective, and I think the most important one is the ability to be able to focus on information and ideas as opposed to individuals. So I think that the future of remote work will be the future of the introverted leader. I think that the vast majority of, when I interview people for the book, I interviewed 24 billion plus remote first organizations. And the biggest signal that I got from all of that group was, number one, their managerial layer was about 50% smaller than the average company of the same size, which is an interesting
That organization, you have more people reporting to you.
Well, there are more people doing work and there are less people telling people what to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So any organization in which you can optimize towards deep work, which is basically solving very difficult problems quickly, you're going to have a faster moving organization. So if you can tighten up that managerial layer, that's a big one. And that's actually due to my second biggest assumption, which I was pretty surprised about, which is why I actually made the entire book about it, which is asynchronous management. The ability to be able to say, listen, I don't need to tell Max what my targets are or what my numbers are, even though Max is my manager, because I'm just going to put it inside of a Google Doc somewhere. It's going to be automatically reported. And then Max doesn't have to tell his manager, and his manager doesn't have to tell the boss. The boss can basically know everything. And not only that, Liam and Max can know everyone's numbers everywhere. You can have the same kind of radically transparent view of the business as the CEO. If you have the same informational advantage as the CEO of the company, you automatically make better decisions up and down the org chart. But more importantly, when difficult decisions need to be made, a lot of people actually understand what the heck is going on. They're like, oh, I understand why we actually have to cut 10% of the workforce, because if we don't right now, we're going to be screwed in 6 months because we don't have the cash to be able to keep going. And that's the part that all of these asynchronous remote first companies had in common.
The percentage of those big companies that are, going for hundreds or thousands of employees that are, like truly remote, where you can hire anybody in the globe, is quite small, right? Because usually they would pick 1, 2, or, a handful of countries to run remote.
Absolutely. That's something that I think is changing. Companies like ourselves, GitLab, GitLab hires everywhere on planet Earth. Companies like Todoist, they hire everywhere on planet Earth. Bug hires everywhere on planet Earth. But Zapier, those are actually maybe very small companies. Zapier as well. But they actually have a lot of their employees located in North America. They've just realized that there are some asynchronous versus synchronous challenges. So they've realized that they actually need to silo at least some overhang hours. But the companies that are incredibly successful have basically just built their businesses with this one core assumption, which is, what if we could never talk to anyone in person? What if we could not communicate synchronously? What if there was no way for us to be able to do it? There's some Zoom, explodes tomorrow. There's no more Google Meet. There's no more Skype. What the heck do we do? How do we build a business that way? And then when you put your mind into that perspective, you actually build a business that is incredibly resistant towards problems. We're currently seeing a huge conflict between Russia and Ukraine right now, a war between Russia and Ukraine right now. You can sidestep a lot of those problems, but more importantly, this actually makes your business much more effective to scale. So if you have the process be the manager, as opposed to the manager, you can train 1,000 sales reps, not just 1 or 2 at a time.
One question that I always go back to is hiring mistakes. And in the context of remote hiring, as you pointed out, some people will be at a psychological disadvantage in a remote organization, extroverts notably, and you've given some tools to work on that. But when you think back on your personal journey as an employer, as a recruiter, and you think about some of the mistakes that you've made, can you point to one example where you hired somebody, it didn't work out, and what lessons the audience can take from that unfortunate experience?
I mean, you
got to pick one, because I know you got dozens that are flying through your mind right now.
No, that's so we always assess every quarter. Actually, we assess regrettable and unregrettable terminations. So there are some people that quit, and we think to ourselves, "Oh man, thank God he quit, because otherwise we would have had to fire him." Right? And you've all been. I mean, everyone that's managing a company right now, you've been in that headspace. So we try to basically identify, is more than 25% of our termination events regrettable? If that is, then we're basically in pretty serious trouble, and we need to be able to make a shift pretty quickly. In terms of the reasons, I would probably say it's almost entirely connected back to culture. And I hate to use that term, because I actually hate that, like, it's such an all-encompassing term. But I can remember I did an interview for a salesperson, and this person was incredibly well-positioned for a job with our company, had the right experience, worked with the right type of technology, understood our technology stack, understood our CRM systems. And throughout this interview, he said, "Oh, well, I don't really believe in remote work." And I was like, "Oh, what do you mean? What do you mean you don't believe in remote work?" And he gave me a long answer. He basically said that remote work doesn't work and it's not going to be successful long term. And I said, so you know that our mission statement is that we're trying to empower the world's transition towards remote work, right? And he said, yeah, but I can sell this software. I'm just telling you straight up, I don't necessarily believe in, remote work. I was like, awesome. Thank God.
I mean, in hindsight,
because I need to get out of here right now. Like, you need to get off the bus immediately. So really, for me, it's just identifying. I mean, the vast majority of the people that we hire right now with the Great Resignation, they can find another job instantly. And they can probably find a better job, actually, long-term. We're relatively competitive, but Facebook and Google and Apple and all of these big corporations are all spinning up remote hiring at scale. So I actually think the remote pioneers like us are going to be significantly left behind in comparison to what hiring was like, 2 or 3 years ago. But it's just literally saying, listen, do you actually connect to what we really care about? Would you do this job for free? If you had 10 million in the bank, what part of this job would you do for free? Would you do any of this job for free? If the answer is yes, then that's someone who I would keep for an extended amount of time.
Did you hire the salesperson, Liam? Did you hire the salesperson you were talking about in your example?
We got rid of them immediately. That was immediately out of the game. Yeah, because to me,
so I got to hold you accountable here because you dodged my question. The question was a hiring mistake that you made.
It was such a lot. Like, there's a ton of people, and they're all kind of. And I also want to be respectful of. If I tell a personal story, I might identify something.
You might get caught.
We just don't want to do that. We want to make sure that everyone, like, when people leave the company, they may disagree or agree with our decision, but at least we want them to feel like it was a fair decision that was made and that they've left on good terms. If I had to really look at a core part, again, it would come back to that cultural part. It would come back to did they actually really identify with what we were as a company? I can tell you actually right now, one of the conflicts that we've had just recently was COVID really grew everything in remote work. So we had extraordinary growth during COVID. And our DNA as a company is a bootstrapped company. We are bootstrapped. We've never raised any money. And so we were hiring a lot of people that were really, really experienced people that could scale venture-backed companies. And we came up against some of that resistance. And we basically discovered, by we, I mean like me and my co-founder discovered that that's actually part of our culture is being bootstrapped and being a little bit, some people would call us cheap. Probably a lot of people would call us cheap, but just being more thrifty with where we put our dollar and thinking a little bit, maybe too much, before making some tactical or strategic decisions in terms of spend. So that's something that we thought this was the direction that we wanted to go as a business. And we realized it took us quite a bit of money and time to be able to recognize that that wasn't the direction that we take as a business. Okay. So I think it's constantly evolving. And the thing is that when we actually came back to the team members that were having that type of tension with us and we explained it to them, they were like, you know what? I agree. You guys, it's just not, you're absolutely right. This is probably not the way that we want to go. And it's much better if these people move on to something else as opposed to continue on in the business. And they moved on and they all got salaries double what we had, because they were really, really good people and they were incredibly passionate about the subject. But it's just, again, with hiring people, especially those A players, don't be concerned about letting them go. It may actually be the best thing that you could possibly do for them.
Really, if you're building key takeaway here is if you've built a unique culture around bootstrapping, but it's just a form of hustle and can-do attitude with limited needs sometimes. You don't want to dilute that culture, even if it looks great on the resume. And it's an important element to preserve. So thanks for those lessons and for sharing, Liam. And if people want to get a hold of you and they want to buy your book, what's the best way for them to do so?
If you go to runningremote.com/book, you'll be able to go and check out the book there. We are launching August 16th. And while you're there, if you're interested in going to the Running Remote Conference, it's May 17th and 18th in Montreal, Canada, which is a beautiful place to live. It's
not in the metaverse.
Very close to it. So you know what? You actually have to come to the conference to get the answer to that one. That's all I'll say.
There's a portal. There's a portal inside Montreal that takes you to the next dimension.
It's going to be pretty exciting. I'm pretty excited about it, but you have to come to the conference. I'm not going to give any more than that. And then Time Doctor, just go to timedoctor.com. And then if you want to kind of talk with me, best spot is YouTube. We put up all our talks for free because, again, helping the world transition towards remote work means if you can't afford a ticket for $1,000 or even a book for $30, you can afford free YouTube, and you go to youtube.com/runningremote and you can check out all of our talks there.
Awesome. Thanks, Liam.
Thank you.
That was Liam Martin from Time Doctor and Remote Work. Liam was one of the first people to advocate for the remote work culture. And as one of the early adopters, for years, he has been hearing the same things we all have been hearing, which is remote is good for a certain type of autonomous people who like to write and who can do a lot of deep work on their own and who do not need control. But Liam is presenting the next phase of remote work and is working on getting remote work to function for all of humanity. And which is why it's interesting, he defaults back to what is the main tool that he uses to hire the right people in a remote organization? It's culture. It's that C word that everybody has been using for a long time to describe their recruitment strategy. Liam defaults to culture as the most important asset to build on when you're hiring remotely. Hope you enjoyed it and that you'll be back for more. Please remember to subscribe and share.